Hell's Angel's son Rex, a American diner, until a waitress silently shows him kindness. The morning sun filtered through the glass windows of Jerry's diner, casting warm squares of light across the checkered floor. The neon "Open" sign hummed quietly, a familiar beacon that had guided hungry souls to this haven for over 4 decades. Inside, the aroma of fresh coffee mingled with the sweet scent of maple syrup and the savory smell of crispy bacon. Claire, her salt and pepper hair neatly tucked beneath a small white cap, moved with practiced ease behind the counter. Her comfortable shoes squeaked softly against the worn linoleum as she refilled coffee cups and exchanged warm smiles with her regular customers. The coffee machine hissed and sputtered, a sound as familiar to her as her own heartbeat. "More coffee, George?" she asked, already tilting the pot toward his cup. The elderly man in his usual corner booth nodded, his newspaper rustling as he folded it back. "You're an angel, Claire," he said, lifting the fresh cup to his lips. At the counter, Martha and Betty, the town's self-appointed gossip committee, huddled over their breakfast plates. Their whispered conversations about the latest town drama mixed with the gentle clinking of their forks against ceramic. "Did you hear about the Petersons' girl?" Martha leaned in closer to Betty, her voice dropping even lower. "She's moving to California next month. Her mother is beside herself." The kitchen door swung open with a gentle squeak as Mike, the cook, called out, "Order up." The plate of golden pancakes steamed invitingly as Claire carried it to table 4, where Tom, the local hardware store owner, sat reading the morning paper. The regulars formed a comfortable tableau. Mr. Jenkins solving his daily crossword puzzle by the window, Sarah from the flower shop enjoying her usual breakfast of wheat toast and scrambled eggs, and old Joe nursing his 3rd cup of coffee while chatting with anyone willing to listen about his days as a truck driver. The bell above the door chimed suddenly, cutting through the peaceful morning atmosphere. A tall man in a worn leather jacket stepped inside, his heavy boots thudding against the floor. Tattoos snaked up his arms and disappeared beneath his sleeves, and a scruffy beard shadowed his face. Behind him, a small boy with unruly brown hair followed, his sneakers untied and his t-shirt wrinkled. The diner's comfortable murmur faltered. Martha and Betty's gossip died mid-sentence, and Mr. Jenkins peered over his crossword puzzle with wary eyes. The man's presence seemed to fill the small space, making it feel somehow smaller. "Daddy, I don't want to be here," the boy suddenly shouted, his voice piercing the silence. He kicked at a nearby chair, sending it clattering to the floor with a loud bang that made several customers jump. "Joey, stop that right now," the man growled, but his words only seemed to fuel the child's distress. Joey's face reddened as he began to scream, a high-pitched wail that bounced off the walls. He spun around, his small arms swinging wildly, knocking a stack of menus off the counter. They scattered across the floor like fallen leaves. The other customers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. George disappeared behind his newspaper, and Martha and Betty huddled closer together, throwing worried glances at the scene unfolding before them. The peaceful morning atmosphere had evaporated, replaced by a thick tension that hung in the air like storm clouds. Joey continued his tantrum, tears now streaming down his face as he kicked at another chair. His father stood rigid, his jaw clenched, as the other patrons watched the chaos unfold in uncomfortable silence. "Before you continue listening, please let me know where in the world are you watching from today." Now back to the story. The napkin dispenser clattered across the black and white checkered floor, spinning wildly before hitting the base of an empty booth. Joey's small face was red with anger as he grabbed whatever he could reach from the nearest table. His fingers closed around a glass salt shaker, and he hurled it toward the counter. "Hey now," one of the elderly customers muttered, shifting nervously in his seat. Ronnie stood frozen, his weathered hands clenched at his sides. The leather of his jacket creaked as his shoulders tensed, and the dark circles under his eyes seemed even deeper as he watched his son's outburst. His mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. Joey's sneakers squeaked against the linoleum as he darted between tables, leaving chaos in his wake. His small hands grabbed a ketchup bottle, and with surprising force for a 6-year-old, he slammed it down. The red condiment exploded across the table, splattering the worn surface and dripping onto the floor. The diner fell silent except for Joey's ragged breathing and the soft pat-pat-pat of ketchup hitting the floor. The morning regulars pressed themselves against their booth seats, coffee cups held midway to their lips. A few gathered their belongings, ready to make a quick exit. Someone needs to control that child, a woman whispered loudly enough for everyone to hear. Joey's eyes darted around the room like a cornered animal. His small chest heaved with each breath, and tears began forming in the corners of his eyes. He grabbed a handful of sugar packets and threw them in the air, watching them rain down around him. Ronnie took a half step forward, his face a mask of helplessness and shame. The Hell's Angels patch on his jacket seemed to gleam under the fluorescent lights, a stark reminder of a life he was trying to leave behind. But when it came to his son's outburst, he appeared lost, unsure how to bridge the gap between them. Claire watched from behind the counter, her gray hair neatly pulled back, her kind eyes taking in the scene. Without rushing, she reached under the counter and pulled out something she kept for moments just like this. With steady steps, she moved around the mess of condiments and sugar packets, approaching Joey as if she were walking through a peaceful garden rather than a war zone. She didn't raise her voice or scold. Instead, she knelt down to Joey's eye level, maintaining a comfortable distance. In her hands, she held a pack of well-loved crayons and a coloring book with slightly bent corners. "Would you like to color for a while, sweetie?" she asked softly, her voice carrying the warmth of a grandmother's kitchen. Joey's hand, which had been reaching for another sugar dispenser, stopped mid-grab. His eyes locked onto the crayons, then darted to Claire's face, searching for any sign of trick or trap. Finding only gentleness there, his shoulders began to relax, just a fraction. Claire smiled and opened the coloring book to a fresh page. It showed a bright circus scene, full of animals and acrobats waiting to be brought to life with color. She sat on a clean table, along with the crayons, and pulled out a chair. The diner held its collective breath as Joey stood there, his small fists slowly unclenching. The storm of emotions that had been raging across his face began to calm, like clouds parting after a heavy rain. His bottom lip trembled slightly as he took one tentative step toward the table, then another. The silence in the diner now held a different quality, not the tense quiet of fear, but the soft hush of witnessing something delicate and precious unfold. Joey's small hands trembled as he picked up the red crayon. The diner had gone quiet, save for the soft scratch of wax against paper and the distant hum of the coffee maker. Ronnie stood a few feet away, his weathered hands gripping the back of an empty chair, knuckles white with tension. He watched his son, noting how Joey's dark hair fell across his forehead, just like his mother's used to. The thought made Ronnie's jaw clench. The leather of his jacket creaked as he shifted his weight, drawing a few nervous glances from the other customers. Claire moved between tables with practiced ease, refilling coffee cups and offering gentle smiles, but she kept a watchful eye on the pair. Ronnie noticed how she seemed to create a buffer between them and the other patrons, her movements deliberate and protective. Joey pressed the crayon harder against the paper, his strokes becoming more aggressive. The red lines he drew looked like angry scars across the page. Ronnie recognized that anger. He'd lived with it himself for too many years. Seeing it in his 6-year-old son made his chest ache. "You're doing great there, sweetheart," Claire said softly as she passed by, setting a glass of water near Joey's elbow. The boy didn't look up, but his grip on the crayon loosened slightly. Ronnie watched the scene unfold, feeling like an outsider in his own son's life. His tattooed arms, marked with years of bad decisions and worse company, hung uselessly at his sides. He wanted to reach out, to say something, but the words stuck in his throat like tar. The morning sun streamed through the diner's windows, casting long shadows across the checkered floor. Joey switched to a blue crayon, his movements becoming less rigid. For a moment, it seemed like the storm had passed. Then Joey's hand froze mid-stroke. His lower lip started to quiver, and the crayon slipped from his fingers, rolling across the table. "I miss Mom," he whispered, his voice cracking. Claire paused nearby, coffee pot still in hand. The other customers pretended not to listen, but their conversations died away. Joey's words came out in hiccups now, tears beginning to stream down his cheeks. She said she'd come back. She promised. His small shoulders began to shake. But she lied. She always lies. Ronnie felt like he'd been punched in the gut. His son's words hung in the air like smoke, choking him with their truth. He took a half step forward, then stopped, paralyzed by his own inadequacy. I don't know what I did wrong, Joey continued, his voice rising with distress. Was I bad? Is that why she left? The words tumbled out between sobs, each one striking Ronnie like a physical blow. The coloring book lay forgotten as Joey pressed his hands against his face, trying to hide his tears. His small body shook with the force of his grief, raw and uncontained. Ronnie stood rooted to the spot, his face a mask of pain. His hands opened and closed uselessly at his sides, every muscle in his body screaming to comfort his son, but he remained frozen. Years of violence and survival had taught him how to fight, how to intimidate, how to survive, but nothing had prepared him for this moment. Watching his little boy's heart break in a quiet diner on a sunny morning. Ronnie pushed open the diner's glass door, the little bell jingling as he stepped into the crisp morning air. His weathered boots scraped against the concrete as he paced back and forth, running his calloused hands through his graying hair. The weight of Joey's words, about his mother leaving them, sat heavy in his chest like a stone. Through the window, Claire watched him, her hands absently wiping the same spot on the counter over and over. 40 years of serving coffee had taught her when to speak and when to let silence do the work. The morning sun caught the silver in her hair as she turned her attention back to Joey, who was now hunched over his coloring book, his small shoulders shaking with quiet sobs. "Would you like some chocolate milk, sweetie?" Claire asked softly, keeping her voice steady and warm. Joey nodded without looking up, his crayon moving in angry circles across the paper. The other customers had fallen into an uncomfortable quiet. Mrs. Peterson, who usually complained about everything from the temperature of her coffee to the weather, sat perfectly still, her half-eaten toast forgotten. Mr. Wilson, the retired mailman who came in every morning at 8 sharp, pretended to read his newspaper, but his eyes hadn't moved from the same spot for minutes. Outside, Ronnie pressed his forehead against the cool brick wall of the diner. His leather jacket creaked as his shoulders rose and fell with heavy breaths. The skull tattoo on his neck, a reminder of his past life, seemed to mock him now. He tried so hard to leave that world behind, to be better for Joey, but his son's pain proved how badly he'd failed. Claire filled a glass with chocolate milk and placed it near Joey's elbow. The boy's drawing was all dark colors, black, brown, and purple scribbles that spoke of storms inside his young mind. She noticed how his free hand clutched the edge of the table, his knuckles white with tension. When the bell chimed again, Claire looked up to see Ronnie walking back in. His steps were slower now, his usual swagger replaced by something that looked like surrender. The morning light caught the scars on his face, telling stories of fights and hard living that Claire could only imagine. He approached the counter, his eyes fixed on the worn linoleum surface. "I'm sorry," he mumbled, the words barely audible. "For everything." He slid onto a stool, his broad shoulders hunched forward as if trying to make himself smaller. Claire just nodded, understanding in her gentle eyes. She didn't offer empty words or push him to explain. Instead, she poured him a fresh cup of coffee, sliding it across the counter with the same care she'd shown his son. Ronnie wrapped his hands around the warm mug, but didn't drink. His eyes drifted to Joey, who was still absorbed in his angry artwork. The morning light streamed through the windows, casting long shadows across the diner's checkerboard floor, and in that quiet moment, the weight of everything unsaid filled the space between father and son. Claire continued her work, giving them space while staying close enough to show she cared. She'd seen many troubled souls come through these doors over the years, but something about this pair touched her heart differently. The biker with his tough exterior and the little boy with storms in his eyes, They both needed something she couldn't quite name, but she knew it started with kindness. Claire watched Joey's small hand move across the paper, his crayon making careful strokes. The diner had settled back into its usual rhythm, but she could feel the heaviness in the boy's shoulders. His earlier outburst had left him drained, his eyes still red from crying. "That's a really nice drawing," Claire said softly, sliding into the booth beside him. "Would you like to tell me about it?" Joey's hand paused mid-stroke. He stared at the paper, where he'd drawn what looked like two figures, one big, one small, standing far apart from each other. "It's me and Dad," he mumbled, his voice barely above a whisper. Claire nodded, keeping her voice gentle. "I see. And why are you standing so far apart?" Joey's lower lip trembled. "Because sometimes Dad gets really angry. He yells and breaks things." His fingers tightened around the crayon until his knuckles turned white. "Like that time those men came to our house. Dad threw a chair at them." Claire's heart ached, but she kept her face calm. "That must have been scary for you." "Yeah." Joey picked up a black crayon and started coloring the space between the figures. "Mom used to try to stop him, but then she left. She said she couldn't take it anymore." His voice cracked. "She didn't even say goodbye to me." Claire resisted the urge to hug him, sensing he needed space to let his words flow. Joey continued drawing, adding dark clouds above the figures. "Sometimes I hear Dad crying at night," Joey confessed, his hand shaking slightly. "He thinks I'm sleeping, but I'm not. He looks at old pictures and drinks that stuff that makes him smell funny." He looked up at Claire, his eyes wide with worry. "Is it my fault? Did Mom leave because of me?" "No, sweetheart," Claire said firmly, placing her hand gently on the table near his. "None of this is your fault. Sometimes grown-ups make choices that hurt people they love, but that's never the child's fault." Joey's shoulders slumped. "The kids at school say my dad's a bad person because he was in a gang. They say I'll be just like him." His voice dropped to a whisper. "Sometimes I get really angry too, like him. What if they're right?" From across the diner, Claire could see Ronnie watching them. He stood near the counter, his coffee untouched, his face a mask of pain as he listened to his son's words. "Listen to me, Joey," Claire said, her voice warm but serious. "You are your own person. You get to choose who you want to be. And if you ever feel scared or angry or sad, you can always come talk to me. I'll be right here." Joey looked up at her, hope flickering in his eyes. "Really? You won't get tired of me like Mom did?" "Really," Claire assured him. "Everyone needs someone to talk to sometimes. Even your dad." Joey nodded slowly, returning to his drawing. He picked up a yellow crayon and began adding a sun peeking through the dark clouds. Claire glanced at Ronnie, who quickly looked away, his hands gripping the counter edge. She could see the shame and regret written across his face, the weight of his son's words crushing him. He stood there, frozen between approaching his son and retreating, a man desperately wanting to change, but unsure if he could. The afternoon sun filtered through the diner's windows, casting long shadows across the worn linoleum floor. Ronnie sat alone in his booth, his large frame hunched over the table, his weathered hands wrapped around a cold cup of coffee he hadn't touched. The leather jacket he wore felt heavy on his shoulders, like the weight of his past pressing down on him. Claire approached with a fresh pot of coffee, her footsteps quiet but steady. "Looks like you could use a warm-up," she said, her voice gentle. Steam rose from the dark liquid as she filled his cup. "Thanks," Ronnie mumbled, not meeting her eyes. His fingers traced the rim of the cup, his knuckles scarred from countless fights. The familiar smell of coffee mixed with grease and maple syrup reminded him of simpler times, before the gang, before the violence. Memories flickered through his mind like an old movie reel, nights spent riding with the Hells Angels, the roar of motorcycles drowning out any doubt or fear. The brotherhood had seemed so important then, a family bound by leather and steel. But now, watching Joey color quietly at the counter, those memories felt toxic. Claire lingered for a moment, her presence somehow both unobtrusive and comforting. "Sometimes the hardest part is letting ourselves believe we deserve better," she said softly, then moved away to tend to other customers. Ronnie's jaw clenched. He tried to leave that life behind, but the pull was still there. The power, the respect, or what he'd thought was respect. Fear, really. He'd gotten good at making people afraid. Too good. His eyes drifted to Joey again, watching his son's small hand grip the blue crayon as he worked on his picture. The boy deserved better than a father who solved problems with his fists. The diner's bell chimed, and Ronnie's whole body tensed before he even looked up. Some instincts never died. When he saw who it was, his stomach dropped. Greg stood in the doorway, his presence filling the space like a storm cloud. The silver rings on his fingers caught the light, brass knuckles disguised as jewelry. His eyes found Ronnie immediately, narrowing with contempt. The other customers seemed to sense the shift in the air. Conversations died down, replaced by the nervous clink of silverware against plates. Greg made his way to Ronnie's booth, each step deliberate and threatening. Well, Greg said, his voice low but carrying across the quiet diner. Look who's playing house. He slid into the seat across from Ronnie, uninvited. His leather cut was newer than Ronnie's, the patches bright and proud. What do you want, Greg? Ronnie's voice was tight, controlled. His eyes flickered to Joey, still absorbed in his coloring, then back to Greg. The boys have been talking. Greg leaned forward, his forearms on the table. They're not happy with how you left things. You can't just walk away from family. I'm done with that life. Ronnie's words came out stronger than he felt. Greg's laugh was sharp and ugly. Done? Nobody's done until we say they're done. He jabbed a finger at the table. You owe us. And now we're calling in that debt. The tension crackled between them like electricity. Ronnie could feel Claire watching from behind the counter, could sense the other patrons try not to stare. His past and present were colliding in this small diner, and he felt powerless to stop it. Greg's heavy boots echoed across the diner's linoleum floor as he approached Ronnie's table. The morning sunlight streaming through the windows caught the silver rings on his fingers, brass knuckles without the brass. His leather vest creaked as he slid into the booth across from Ronnie. Well, playing family man now are we? Greg's voice was quiet but carried an edge sharp enough to cut. His eyes flickered to Joey, who was still coloring at the counter under Claire's watchful eye. Ronnie's jaw tightened. What do you want, Greg? You know exactly what I want. Greg leaned forward, his forearms resting on the table. The club's been talking. You still owe us 20 grand from that job you walked away from. Remember that. The coffee in Ronnie's cup rippled as his hand trembled slightly. He set it down carefully, keeping his voice low. I told you, I'm done with all that. I'm out. Greg's laugh was hollow. Out? Nobody's ever really out, brother. You know that better than anyone. He gestured toward Joey. Sweet kid you got there. Be ashamed if something happened to him because his daddy couldn't pay his debts. Ronnie's face darkened. The muscle in his jaw jumped as he clenched his teeth. Don't you dare threaten my son. Then come back where you belong, Greg pressed, his voice taking on a false friendliness. The club needs you. One job and your debt's cleared. Simple as that. The diner had grown quieter. The regular customers were trying not to stare, but their discomfort was palpable. Claire stood behind the counter, her hand resting near the phone, watching the exchange with concern. It's never just one job with you guys, Ronnie said, his voice rough with emotion. I've got Joey to think about now. I can't. Can't what? Greg cut him off. Can't be who you really are? Come on, Ronnie. Look at yourself. You think playing house is going to change what's in your blood? Ronnie's eyes drifted to Joey, who was focused on his coloring book, oblivious to the tension around him. He thought about the tears in his son's eyes earlier, the pain of abandonment he'd already endured. No, Ronnie said, his voice firm for the first time. I'm not going back. Greg's friendly facade cracked. His eyes turned cold. Wrong answer, brother. He stood up slowly, towering over the table. You've got till the end of the week to change your mind. After that, he let the threat hang in the air. Ronnie met his gaze steadily. I said no, Greg. I mean it. Find someone else to do your dirty work. A smirk spread across Greg's face, but it didn't reach his eyes. You're going to regret this, Ronnie. Mark my words. He turned to leave, his boots striking the floor with deliberate force. At the door, he paused, throwing one last look over his shoulder at Ronnie. The bell above the door chimed as Greg left, but the sound seemed to echo in the tense silence he left behind. The morning sun caught the Hells Angels patch on his back as he disappeared into the parking lot, a final reminder of the life Ronnie was trying to leave behind. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the diner's windows, highlighting the worry lines on Ronnie's face. His coffee sat untouched, growing cold as his mind raced with Greg's threats. His calloused hands trembled slightly as he gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles white from the pressure. Joey looked up from his coloring book, his crayon hovering over an unfinished drawing of a bright yellow sun. He watched his father's face with the keen awareness that children often have of their parents' emotions. The diner had grown quieter since Greg's departure, but the tension still hung heavy in the air like storm clouds. "Dad," Joey's small voice cracked slightly. "Are you okay?" Ronnie forced a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Yeah, buddy, I'm fine," but his gaze kept darting to the window, checking for any sign of Greg's return. Claire moved between tables, refilling coffee cups and taking orders, but her attention never strayed far from the troubled pair. She noticed how Ronnie's shoulders hunched forward, as if carrying an invisible weight. The other customers had returned to their conversations, but their voices were hushed, stealing glances at Ronnie and his son. Joey put down his crayon and reached across the table, placing his small hand over his father's clenched fist. The simple gesture made Ronnie's breath catch in his throat. His son's touch was gentle, innocent, everything that his past life wasn't. "Can we go home now?" Joey asked, his eyes wide with concern. "I don't feel like coloring anymore." Ronnie nodded slowly, his throat tight with emotion. He reached for his wallet with shaking hands, but Claire was already there, shaking her head. "It's on the house today," she said softly, her kind eyes meeting Ronnie's troubled gaze. "You boys take care now." Joey carefully gathered his crayons, placing them back in their box with unusual care. He folded his drawing and tucked it into his pocket, then slid out of the booth. Ronnie stood up, his movements stiff and mechanical, like a man trying to keep himself from falling apart. "Thank you," Ronnie managed to say to Claire, his voice rough with emotion. "For everything." The words seemed inadequate for the kindness she'd shown them, but they were all he could manage. Joey reached up and took his father's hand, squeezing it tight. The gesture seemed to steady Ronnie somewhat, like an anchor in rough seas. They made their way toward the door, Joey's small steps matching his father's slower pace. Claire stood behind the counter, her dish towel forgotten in her hands as she watched them. The afternoon light caught the dust motes floating in the air, creating a soft glow around father and son as they walked together. She saw how Joey looked up at his father with worried eyes, and how Ronnie's hand tightened protectively around his son's. The bell above the door chimed softly as they stepped out into the afternoon sun. Through the window, Claire could see them pause on the sidewalk, Ronnie scanning the street before leading Joey away. She knew they carried with them not just Greg's threats, but also the weight of choices yet to be made. The diner slowly returned to its usual rhythm, coffee being poured, plates clinking, quiet conversations resuming. But Claire remained still for a moment longer, watching the space where Ronnie and Joey had been, hoping that the small kindnesses she'd shown might somehow help light their way forward. The morning sun barely filtered through the grimy windows of their small apartment. Ronnie sat at the kitchen table, staring at a stack of unpaid bills. His calloused hands trembled as he counted the meager cash he had left. $23 wouldn't get them through the week. Joey's cereal bowl sat empty on the counter. The boy had eaten the last of their food for breakfast, and Ronnie's stomach growled in protest. He'd skipped his own meal again, making sure his son had enough. The weight of responsibility pressed down on his shoulders like a heavy chain. "Dad," Joey's small voice came from the doorway. He stood there in his wrinkled pajamas, clutching his worn teddy bear. "Can we go to the diner today?" Ronnie's jaw clenched. The diner had become Joey's safe haven over the past few days. Claire's gentle presence seemed to calm something in the boy that Ronnie couldn't reach. But every time they went there, he felt exposed, vulnerable to Greg or any other gang member who might spot them. "Not today, buddy," Ronnie said, his voice rough. "We need to lay low for a while." Joey's face fell, and Ronnie felt the familiar stab of guilt. His phone buzzed again, Another message from Greg. He'd been sending threats all week, each one more aggressive than the last. The gang wanted their money, and they weren't taking no for an answer. Later that afternoon, despite his earlier refusal, Ronnie found himself walking Joey to the diner anyway. He couldn't bear the disappointed look in his son's eyes. The bell chimed as they entered, and Claire's warm smile greeted them from behind the counter. "There's my favorite artist," she said to Joey, who managed a small smile in return. While Joey settled into their usual booth with his crayons, Ronnie noticed two men in leather jackets outside the diner. His heart rate spiked. They weren't there by coincidence. The gang was watching them. Claire must have noticed his tension. She brought him a cup of coffee without being asked, then sat down across from him. "Rough week?" she asked quietly. Ronnie nodded, unable to meet her eyes. The coffee cup shook slightly in his hands. "They won't leave us alone," he whispered. Maybe if I just did what they wanted." "Dad!" Joey's voice interrupted his thoughts. The boy had been sitting with Claire for the past hour, drawing pictures and talking softly. Now he stood beside their table, his small face serious. "I don't want to be scared anymore." The words hit Ronnie like a physical blow. He stared at his son, seeing the fear and worry in those young eyes. Eyes that should have been full of childhood innocence instead of adult concerns. "I hear the bad men at night," Joey continued, his voice trembling. "I see you checking the windows all the time. I don't want to run away anymore." Ronnie's throat tightened. He reached for his son, but his hands froze halfway. What would he possibly say? How could he explain that he was trying to protect them both when he felt so lost himself? Joey stood there, waiting for an answer his father couldn't give. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken fears and desperate love. Claire watched them both, her presence steady and understanding, but this was a moment between father and son that even she couldn't bridge. The morning sun cast long shadows across the playground as Ronnie sat on a weathered wooden bench, watching Joey climb the monkey bars. His son's laughter echoed through the park, a sound that made his heart both swell and ache. The peaceful scene felt like a fragile bubble that could burst at any moment. Joey's sneakers kicked up with chips as he jumped down and ran to another piece of equipment. His small face was lit up with joy, temporarily free from the worries that usually haunted his young eyes. Ronnie rubbed his hands together, feeling the rough calluses that told the story of his violent past. "Dad!" Joey called out, waving from the top of the slide. "Watch this." Ronnie managed a smile, raising his hand in acknowledgement. "I see you, buddy. Be careful up there." As Joey slid down, squealing with delight, Ronnie thought about how different things could have been. The gang had been his family once, filling a void he didn't even know he had. But now, looking at his son, he understood what real family meant. Joey ran over to the bench, slightly out of breath, his cheeks flushed from playing. "Can we get ice cream later?" he asked, climbing up to sit beside his father. Ronnie pulled Joey close, feeling the warmth of his small body against his side. "Maybe," he said softly. Then, after a moment of silence, he added, "Joey, I need you to know something." The boy looked up at him with those innocent eyes that seemed to see right through him. Ronnie's throat tightened, but he forced the words out. "No matter what happens, I'm always going to protect you. You understand that, right?" Joey nodded slowly, his previous excitement fading. Because of the bad men? The question hit Ronnie like a punch to the gut. Of course, Joey knew. Kids always knew more than adults gave them credit for. "Yeah, buddy, because of them. But you don't need to worry about that. That's my job." They sat there for a while, watching other families come and go. A mother pushed her daughter on the swings, their laughter carrying across the playground. An elderly couple walked their dog along the path. Normal people living normal lives, the kind of life Ronnie desperately wanted for Joey. The peaceful moment shattered when Ronnie's phone buzzed in his pocket. The number was blocked, but he knew who it was. His jaw clenched as he answered. "Time's up, Ronnie." Greg's voice crackled through the speaker, cold and threatening. "Meet us tonight at the old warehouse. 10 o'clock. If you don't show." There was a pause that made Ronnie's blood run cold. "Well, you know what happens to people who cross us." Ronnie's free hand curled into a fist. "Leave my family out of this, Greg. Then don't make us bring them into it." The line went dead. Ronnie slowly lowered the phone, his face hardening into a mask of determination. He looked at Joey, who was watching him with worried eyes, and felt the weight of his decision pressing down on him like a physical force. His son's safety wasn't just at stake anymore. It was the only thing that mattered. He slipped the phone back into his pocket, his movements controlled and deliberate, fighting to keep his anger from showing on his face. Joey pressed closer to his side, as if sensing the change in his father's mood. The playground suddenly seemed less bright, less safe. The shadows grew longer, and the laughter of other children faded into the background. Ronnie sat perfectly still, his mind racing with the implications of Greg's threat, knowing that whatever he decided next would determine not just his future, but Joey's as well. The morning sun streamed through the diner's windows, casting long shadows across the checkered floor. Ronnie pushed through the door, his shoulders hunched and heavy with worry. The bell's cheerful ring seemed to mock his dark mood. His worn leather jacket hung loose on his frame, evidence of meals missed due to stress. Claire looked up from wiping down the counter, her experienced eyes catching the exhaustion etched on his face. She'd seen that look before, the weight of a past that wouldn't let go. Without a word, she poured him a cup of coffee and placed it at his usual spot. Joey trailed behind his father, clutching his now familiar coloring book. The boy's eyes darted around the diner, searching for any signs of danger. He'd grown more watchful lately, picking up on his father's tension like a tuning fork resonating with nearby sound. "Rough morning," Claire asked softly, sliding a chocolate milk toward Joey. Ronnie wrapped his calloused hands around the coffee mug, seeking its warmth. "Every morning's rough lately." He glanced at Joey, making sure his son was occupied with his coloring before continuing. "I don't know how much longer I can keep this up, Claire. The past, it's not just following me anymore. It's catching up." Claire leaned against the counter, her kind eyes fixed on Ronnie. "You're not running alone anymore. You know that, right?" She gestured subtly toward Joey. "That boy needs his father. Not the man you used to be, but the man you're trying to become." Ronnie's fingers tightened around the mug. "Trying isn't enough when they're breathing down my neck." Greg and his crew. He shook his head. "They don't take no for an answer." "Neither does a father's love," Claire replied, her voice gentle but firm. "I've watched you these past few weeks, Ronnie. You're stronger than you think." Joey looked up from his coloring book, his small face serious. "Dad, can we go to the park again? Like yesterday?" His voice held a hint of hope, a child's simple wish for normalcy. Ronnie's expression softened as he looked at his son. Despite everything, Joey still believed in him, still wanted to spend time with him. "Sure, buddy, we can do that." As they stood to leave, Ronnie reached for his wallet, but Claire waved him off. "It's on the house today," she said with a warm smile. They headed toward the door, Joey clutching his coloring book to his chest. Ronnie's steps were heavy, weighed down by invisible chains of worry and fear. Just as he reached for the door handle, it swung open. Greg stood in the doorway, his imposing figure blocking the morning light. His eyes locked with Ronnie's, and a silent message passed between them. No words were needed. The threat was clear in Greg's cold stare. Joey instinctively pressed closer to his father's side, his small hand finding Ronnie's. The coloring book trembled slightly in his other hand, but he stood his ground beside his dad. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the playground as Ronnie watched Joey climb the monkey bars. His son's laughter rang out, pure and innocent, a sound that made his heart ache with both joy and worry. The park was quiet today, with only a few other families scattered around the colorful equipment. Joey waved from the top of the slide. "Dad, watch this," he called out, his face bright with excitement. Ronnie managed a smile, but it faded as he caught movement at the park entrance. His muscles tensed as he recognized the familiar leather jackets and heavy boots. Greg led the group, flanked by 3 other gang members, their faces hard and purposeful. "Joey," Ronnie called out, his voice steady despite the fear gripping his chest. "Come here, buddy." Greg's boots crunched on the gravel as he approached, his lips curled in a sneer. Well, playing daddy at the park? How sweet." His voice dripped with mockery. The other gang members spread out, forming a loose circle around Ronnie. "Not here, Greg," Ronnie said quietly, his eyes darting to Joey, who was now frozen at the bottom of the slide. Greg stepped closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. You think you could just walk away? After everything? The gang needs you back, Ronnie. We've got business that needs handling, and you owe us. I don't owe you anything anymore, Ronnie replied, his hands clenching into fists. Greg's face darkened. Wrong answer. He jabbed a finger into Ronnie's chest. You've got two choices here. Come back and do what needs to be done, or... He glanced meaningfully at Joey. Well, let's just say accidents happen. Something snapped inside Ronnie. The threat to his son cleared away any remaining doubt. He stepped forward, getting right in Greg's face. You listen to me, he growled, his voice low and deadly serious. I'm done. The gang, the violence, all of it. I'm out. You don't get to decide that, Greg snarled, reaching for Ronnie's jacket. Suddenly, Joey ran forward, wrapping his arms around his father's leg. Leave my dad alone, he shouted, his voice trembling but determined. Ronnie placed a protective hand on Joey's shoulder, drawing strength from his son's courage. He looked Greg straight in the eye. I just did decide. I'm done with the gang. For good. Greg's face twisted with rage. You're making a big mistake, Ronnie. Nobody walks away from us. Nobody. Watch me, Ronnie said firmly, not backing down an inch. He felt Joey's grip tighten on his leg, and it only strengthened his resolve. Greg stared at him for a long moment, his jaw clenched. This isn't over, he spat out. Not by a long shot. His eyes lingered on Joey for a moment before he turned away, gesturing to his men. Ronnie stood his ground, not moving a muscle as Greg and his gang members retreated. He kept his eyes locked on them until they disappeared through the park entrance, their threats hanging in the air like a storm cloud. Joey looked up at his father, his eyes wide. Dad! Ronnie knelt down beside his son, pulling him close. He could feel Joey trembling against him, but there was something else there too, pride in his father's stand against the gang. Ronnie's heart was pounding as he walked away from Greg and his gang members, Joey's small hand tucked safely in his. The afternoon sun warmed their backs as they made their way back to the diner, each step feeling lighter than the last. For the first time in years, Ronnie felt like he could breathe freely. Inside the familiar comfort of the diner, the bell chimed as they entered. The regular customers looked up, but this time their faces showed curiosity rather than fear. Ronnie guided Joey to their usual booth, the vinyl seats squeaking as they sat down. You okay, buddy? Ronnie asked, studying his son's face. Joey nodded, his small fingers playing with the edge of a paper menu. You were brave, Dad, he said quietly. The words hit Ronnie hard. He hadn't felt brave in a long time, mostly just scared and angry. But standing up to Greg, protecting his son, choosing a different path, maybe that was what real courage looked like. Claire appeared at their table, coffee pot in hand. She filled Ronnie's cup without asking, the rich aroma rising in tendrils of steam. You look different, she observed, her kind eyes taking in his changed demeanor. Ronnie wrapped his hands around the warm mug. I feel different, he admitted. Like maybe I can actually do this, be better, you know? The afternoon light streamed through the diner's windows, casting long shadows across their table. Joey pulled out his crayons, the ones Claire had given him, and started drawing. The scratch of wax on paper filled the comfortable silence. I've never stood up to them before, Ronnie continued, his voice low. Always thought I was trapped in that life. But seeing Joey's face today, he trailed off, watching his son concentrate on his artwork. Claire slid into the booth across from them. Sometimes the bravest thing we can do is choose a different path, she said, even when it's scary, even when we're not sure we can do it. You think I can? Ronnie asked, vulnerability creeping into his voice. Claire's face softened. I believe in you, Ronnie. Change isn't easy. It takes time, patience, and a whole lot of courage. But from what I've seen, you've got plenty of that. And you're not alone anymore. Joey looked up from his drawing, his eyes bright. Dad, he asked, tugging at Ronnie's sleeve. Can we go home now? Ronnie looked at his son, really looked at him. He saw hope there, and trust, and love. All the things he'd thought he'd lost the right to years ago. But maybe, just maybe, he could earn them back. A genuine smile spread across Ronnie's face the kind that reached his eyes. "Yeah, buddy," he said, ruffling Joey's hair. "Let's go home." The morning sun streamed through the diner's windows, casting warm patches of light across the worn linoleum floor. Ronnie sat at his usual booth, watching Joey color in his drawing book. The past week had been different, quieter, almost peaceful. The weight on his shoulders felt a little lighter each day he stayed away from the gang. Claire approached their table with a fresh pot of coffee. "The usual?" she asked, already knowing the answer. Her gentle smile hadn't changed since that first day they'd stumbled into her diner. "Thanks, Claire," Ronnie nodded, his voice softer than it used to be. She filled his cup and set a chocolate milk in front of Joey, who beamed up at her. The diner had become their safe place. Every morning, they'd come in for breakfast, and sometimes in the afternoons too. Claire never pushed for conversation, but she was always there, ready to listen when Ronnie needed to talk. "Your pancakes are getting better and better, Joey," Claire commented, noting how the boy was actually eating instead of playing with his food. Joey had stopped having outbursts, though he still had his quiet moments. "Dad says I need to eat all my breakfast to grow strong," Joey said, carefully cutting another piece of pancake. His movements were more controlled now, less frantic. Ronnie watched his son, amazed at how much could change in just a week. The constant fear that had haunted Joey's eyes was fading. The boy even smiled more, especially when Claire was around. During quiet moments, when Joey was absorbed in his coloring, Ronnie would talk to Claire. Sometimes about small things, jobs he was looking into, apartments in better neighborhoods. Other times, about harder things, his fears, his past, his hopes for Joey. "You're doing good, Ronnie," Claire said quietly, refilling his coffee cup. "One day at a time." Ronnie nodded, his throat tight with emotion. He'd never had someone believe in him the way Claire did. Her faith in him made him want to be better, to prove her right. Joey finished his pancakes and looked up at his father. "Can I have another drawing book? This one's almost full." Claire reached under the counter and pulled out a fresh coloring book. "I picked this one up yesterday. It has motorcycles in it," she said with a wink. Joey's eyes lit up. "Thanks, Claire." He immediately opened it and started examining the pages. Ronnie watched his son, struck by how normal this moment felt. No looking over his shoulder, no tension in his muscles, ready to run. Just a father and son having breakfast together. "Dad," Joey looked up from his new book. "I like it here. I feel safe." The words hit Ronnie hard. How long had it been since his son felt safe anywhere? He reached across the table and took Joey's small hand in his. "I promise you, Joey," Ronnie said, his voice firm with determination, his eyes misting slightly. "I'll always protect you, no matter what." Joey squeezed his father's hand, and for the first time in years, Ronnie saw complete trust in his son's eyes. The moment stretched between them, peaceful and pure. Claire quietly moved away, leaving father and son to their breakfast, but she couldn't help smiling as she wiped down the counter. Sometimes she thought all people needed was a chance to prove they could be better. The early morning sun filtered through the diner's windows, casting long shadows across the worn linoleum floor. Ronnie pushed open the glass door, the familiar bell chiming above his head. His shoulders slumped under the weight of another failed job interview. The help-wanted sections of newspapers were starting to feel like a cruel joke. Nobody wanted to hire someone with his background. The diner was quiet at this hour, with only a few regulars nursing their coffee cups. The smell of fresh coffee and warm toast filled the air, bringing a small measure of comfort. Claire looked up from wiping down the counter, her kind eyes crinkling at the corners as she smiled at him. "The usual?" she asked, already reaching for a clean mug. Ronnie nodded, sliding onto his regular stool at the counter. His calloused fingers drummed nervously on the worn Formica surface. "Thanks, Claire." She poured his coffee with practiced ease, adding just the right amount of cream, the way she'd learned he liked it over the past few weeks. "Joey at school?" "Yeah." Ronnie managed a small smile. "He's doing better there. Teacher says he's making friends now." Claire beamed. "That's wonderful news." She paused, studying his face. "But something's troubling you." Ronnie wrapped his hands around the warm mug, staring into the coffee as if it might hold answers. "Can't find work," he admitted quietly. "Nobody's willing to take a chance on." He gestured vaguely at himself, at the tattoos visible beneath his rolled-up sleeves. Claire leaned against the counter, her face thoughtful. Have you considered starting small? Maybe something in construction or landscaping. Tried that, Ronnie sighed. But as soon as they run a background check. He shook his head. Who wants to hire an ex-biker with a record? Claire refilled his cup without asking. You know, my late husband used to say that the hardest step is the first one. Sometimes you have to start at the very bottom. What do you mean? Well, Claire said, wiping her hands on her apron, there's honest work out there that doesn't ask too many questions. Car washes, moving companies, day labor. It's not glamorous, but it's a start. Ronnie's jaw tightened. The thought of such basic work made his pride sting. But then he remembered Joey's face when he'd promised things would be different now. Maybe you're right, he admitted. Just, it's hard, you know, starting over from nothing. Nobody said it would be easy, Claire replied gently. But you're doing it for the right reasons. That counts for something. Ronnie took a long sip of his coffee, letting her words sink in. The morning light caught the gray in Claire's hair, reminding him of all the wisdom she carried. She'd seen countless stories unfold in this diner, and somehow she still believed in second chances. I could make some calls, she offered. I know a few people who might be willing to give you a chance. Good people who understand that everyone deserves an opportunity to change. Ronnie felt a lump form in his throat. The kindness in her voice made his chest tight. I'd appreciate that, he managed to say, his voice rough with emotion. Claire patted his hand briefly before turning to serve another customer. When she returned, she found Ronnie still deep in thought, wrestling with the idea of starting from scratch. His past life had given him status, respect, even if it was born of fear. Now he'd have to earn everything the hard way. It won't be easy, he said finally, meeting Claire's eyes. But I've got to try. For Joey. The evening sun cast long shadows across the empty street as Ronnie walked home, his footsteps echoing against the concrete. His mind wandered to Joey, waiting at the diner with Claire. The weight of his earlier conversation about finding honest work still pressed on his shoulders. A motorcycle's rumble broke the silence. Ronnie's muscles tensed as he recognized the sound. A Harley-Davidson, Greg's preferred ride. The bike pulled up beside him, and Greg cut the engine. You think you could just walk away? Greg's voice was cold as he dismounted. His leather jacket creaked as he stepped closer to Ronnie. After everything the club did for you? Ronnie kept walking, his jaw clenched. I told you I'm done. Greg grabbed Ronnie's shoulder, spinning him around. Two more bikes appeared at the end of the street, their riders watching silently. You know that's not how this works, Greg snarled, his face inches from Ronnie's. You owe us. I don't owe you anything, Ronnie said, shrugging off Greg's hand. His heart hammered in his chest, but he kept his voice steady. Greg's laugh was sharp and ugly. That kid of yours, he said, pulling out his phone. He showed Ronnie a photo of Joey at the park from yesterday. Sweet little boy. Be ashamed if something happened to him. Ronnie's blood ran cold. His fists clenched at his sides, knuckles white with rage. You stay away from my son. Then you know what you need to do, Greg pressed, putting the phone away. Come back to the club. One call, and everything goes back to normal. Joey stays safe. For a moment, Ronnie saw red. The old him would have thrown the first punch, would have let violence answer this threat. But Joey's face flashed in his mind, his son's hopeful smile when they shared breakfast at the diner that morning. No, Ronnie said, his voice firm. I'm not going back. Not ever. Greg's face darkened. You're making a big mistake. He stepped closer, his hand moving to his jacket pocket. Last chance. Ronnie stood his ground. My answer's still no. You come near my boy, and you'll regret it. His voice was quiet but carried a steel edge that made even Greg pause. The tension crackled between them. Greg's hand stayed in his pocket, but he didn't make a move. The other riders revved their engines in the distance, an implicit threat. You're dead to the club, Greg spat. And when things go bad, and they will, don't come crawling back. Ronnie met his gaze steadily. I won't. Greg mounted his bike, the engine roaring to life. Watch your back, he called over the noise. And keep an eye on that kid of yours. The bikes disappeared down the street, leaving Ronnie alone in the growing dusk. His hand shook slightly, but not from fear. For the first time in years, he felt certain about his path. Joey needed him, not as a gang member, but as a father. He'd made his choice. There was no going back now. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the street as Ronnie walked toward the diner. His shoulders were tense, but his steps were steady. He'd made his choice. No more running, no more hiding behind his past. The weight of his decision felt heavy, yet somehow right. Through the diner's windows, he could see Greg and 3 other gang members sitting at a booth. Their leather jackets, adorned with the familiar Hell's Angels patches, seemed to mock everything Ronnie was trying to leave behind. The bell chimed as he pushed open the door, and the usual warm atmosphere of the diner turned cold. "Look who finally showed up," Greg sneered, his fingers drumming against the worn tabletop. The other patrons shifted uncomfortably in their seats, sensing the tension in the air. Ronnie's gaze swept across the diner, relieved to see Joey wasn't there. He'd made sure his son was safe with a neighbor before coming here. His hands clenched into fists at his sides, but he kept his voice steady. "I told you my answer, Greg. It hasn't changed." Greg stood up slowly, his chair scraping against the floor. "You really think you can walk away from us? After everything?" His voice dripped with contempt. "We own you, Ronnie. Always have, always will." The other gang members spread out, creating a semicircle around Ronnie. Their faces were hard, eyes cold with practiced intimidation. Ronnie felt the familiar pull of violence tugging at him, the old instincts telling him to fight. But something was different now. He wasn't fighting for respect or territory. He was fighting for his son's future. "Nobody owns me anymore," Ronnie said, his voice quiet but firm. "I'm done with all of it." Greg's face twisted into an ugly smile. "You've got one last chance, brother. Come back to the fold, or things get ugly. Real ugly." The threat hung in the air like smoke. Claire appeared from behind the counter, her movements calm and deliberate. She carried a pot of coffee, moving between the tables as if it were any other day. But her eyes were sharp, taking in every detail of the situation. "More coffee, gentlemen?" she asked, her voice steady. She stopped beside Ronnie, close enough that he could feel her presence, solid, unwavering. Greg's eyes narrowed at the interruption. "This isn't your business, lady." "Everything that happens in my diner is my business," Claire replied, her tone gentle but firm. She turned to Ronnie, and in that moment he saw something in her eyes that he hadn't seen in years. Genuine belief in him. "You're not alone, Ronnie," she said quietly, just loud enough for him to hear. "You never were." Those simple words hit Ronnie like a physical force. All his life, he'd fought his battles alone, convinced that's how it had to be. But standing there, with Claire's quiet strength beside him, he felt something shift inside him. He straightened his shoulders, looking Greg directly in the eyes. The old fear was still there, but it didn't control him anymore. He had something stronger now, hope for a different future, and someone who believed in him enough to stand beside him. Greg and his men waited, the tension building like a storm about to break. The diner had gone completely silent, every eye fixed on the scene unfolding before them. The moment of truth had arrived, and Ronnie knew his next words would either chain him to his past or free him toward his future. The morning sun filtered through the diner's windows, casting long shadows across the worn linoleum floor. Ronnie stood near the counter, his hands steady despite the tension coursing through his body. Greg and 2 other gang members sat at a booth, their leather jackets creaking as they shifted impatiently. Claire moved quietly behind the counter, her presence a steady anchor in the storm that was about to break. She caught Ronnie's eye and gave him a slight nod, her silent support speaking volumes. Joey sat at the far end of the diner, clutching his coloring book, his small face a mixture of fear and hope. "Last chance, Ronnie," Greg's voice cut through the silence. "You know how this ends if you don't come back." Ronnie took a deep breath, feeling the weight of years of violence and regret on his shoulders. But for the first time, that weight didn't crush him. Instead, it reminded him of everything he was fighting to leave behind. "No," Ronnie said, his voice quiet but firm. "I'm done, Greg. Really done this time." Greg's face darkened. He stood up, his chair scraping against the floor. You don't get to walk away. Nobody walks away. I'm not asking permission, Ronnie replied. He glanced at Joey, then back to Greg. I've got something worth fighting for now. Something real. Claire stepped forward, her movements deliberate and calm. She placed a fresh cup of coffee on the counter, the simple act somehow diffusing some of the tension in the room. Sometimes, she said softly, the bravest thing a man can do is choose peace. Greg sneered at her words, but something in Claire's steady gaze made him shift uncomfortably. The other gang members exchanged uncertain looks. You're making a mistake, Greg growled, but his voice had lost some of its edge. Ronnie shook his head. The mistake was letting the gang become my whole world. My son needs his father. A real father, not a gang member. You're weak, Greg spat, but his words sounded hollow. No, Ronnie said, stepping closer to Greg. I'm stronger than I've ever been, because now I'm fighting for something that matters. The diner had gone completely silent. Even the regular customers seemed to be holding their breath. Joey watched from his corner, his eyes wide with a mix of fear and pride. Greg's hand twitched toward his jacket, but he stopped when he saw the determination in Ronnie's eyes. For the first time, he was facing a man who had nothing left to lose and everything to gain. This isn't over, Greg threatened, but his voice lacked conviction. Yes, it is, Ronnie said quietly. It's been over for a long time. I just didn't see it until now. Greg stood there for a moment longer, his authority crumbling in the face of Ronnie's calm defiance. Finally, with a curse, he turned and stormed toward the door, his boots heavy on the floor. His two companions followed, looking almost relieved to be leaving. As the door slammed behind them, Ronnie felt something shift inside him. The weight that had pressed down on him for so many years began to lift. He turned to look at Joey, still sitting in his corner, and smiled. It was a real smile, one that reached his eyes, the smile of a man who had finally found his way home. The morning sun streamed through the diner's windows, casting warm patches of light across the worn linoleum floor. Ronnie sat in his usual booth, watching Joey color with the crayons Claire had given him weeks ago. The diner felt different now, safer like home. The regular customers had grown used to their presence, offering friendly nods and small talk. Look, Dad. Joey held up his drawing, a colorful mess of blues and greens. It's us at the park. Ronnie leaned forward, studying the crayon figures with genuine interest. That's really good, buddy. His voice was softer these days, gentler. The weight of his past no longer pressed down on his shoulders quite so heavily. Claire appeared with fresh coffee, placing it carefully in front of Ronnie. You two are becoming quite the artists, she said, smiling at Joey's growing collection of drawings spread across the table. We're going to the park later, Joey announced proudly. Dad promised. That sounds wonderful, Claire replied, giving Ronnie an approving look before moving on to her other customers. At the park, Ronnie pushed Joey on the swings, something he'd never done before. The sound of his son's laughter filled the air, pure and uninhibited. It was a sound he'd rarely heard in the past, when fear and uncertainty had dominated their lives. Higher, Dad, Joey called out, pumping his legs as the swing arced through the air. Ronnie obliged, his strong hands giving gentle pushes. He noticed how Joey no longer flinched at sudden movements, how the dark circles under his eyes had faded. The boy was sleeping better now, no longer plagued by nightmares of violence and abandonment. They spent hours at the park, doing simple things that normal fathers and sons did, playing catch, building sandcastles in the playground sandbox, sharing a hot dog from the vendor near the fountain. Ronnie found himself opening up more, answering Joey's endless questions about everything from clouds to butterflies. Back at their small apartment, Ronnie helped Joey with his homework. Math problems and spelling words replaced the tension and fear that had once filled their evenings. The walls, once bare, now displayed Joey's artwork, each piece a testament to their healing relationship. Dad, Joey looked up from his multiplication tables, his eyes serious. Yeah, buddy. I'm glad the bad men are gone. Ronnie's throat tightened. Me too, Joey. Me too. And I'm glad we could go to the diner and see Claire. Joey continued, fidgeting with his pencil. She's nice. She is, Ronnie agreed, thinking of the quiet strength that had helped him find his way. Joey abandoned his homework and moved closer to his father on the couch. "You're different now," he said matter-of-factly. "You smile more." Ronnie pulled his son closer, marveling at how perceptive children could be. The tough exterior he'd worn for so long had melted away, replaced by something stronger, the love of a father for his son. Joey snuggled into his father's side, his small hand finding Ronnie's larger one. "Dad," he whispered. "Yeah." Joey looked up at him, his eyes bright and clear. "I love you." Ronnie felt tears welling up in his eyes, years of regret and fear washing away in that simple moment. His voice trembled as he pulled his son into a tight embrace. "I love you too, Joey. So much." They held each other, father and son, in the quiet of their apartment. For the first time since Joey was born, there was real peace in their embrace. No shadows lurking, no threats waiting. Just love, pure and healing, between a father and his son. Ronnie sat at his kitchen table early one morning, spreading out job applications across the worn surface. The morning sun filtered through the window, casting a warm glow on the scattered papers. His calloused hands, once used for violence, now carefully filled out forms with determination in each stroke of the pen. Joey watched from across the table, munching on his cereal. "What kind of job are you looking for, Dad?" Ronnie looked up, meeting his son's curious eyes. "Anything honest, buddy. Maybe construction work or at the loading docks." He managed a small smile. "It's not glamorous, but it's good work." The local newspaper lay open beside him, one ad circled in red marker. Some are already crossed out, places that wouldn't hire someone with his background. But Ronnie refused to let it discourage him. Each rejection just made him more determined. "Can I help?" Joey asked, pushing his empty bowl aside. Ronnie's heart swelled at his son's offer. "Sure thing, kiddo. Why don't you help me organize these papers?" Together, they sorted the applications into neat piles. Joey's small hands carefully straightened each stack, his face scrunched in concentration. The simple act of working together filled the kitchen with a peaceful energy that Ronnie had never known in his old life. Later that morning, they walked to the diner for breakfast, their new daily ritual. Joey skipped ahead, stopping to examine interesting rocks and leaves along the way. Ronnie watched him, amazed at how resilient children could be. Just weeks ago, his son had been scared and acting out. Now, he was slowly blooming into a happy kid. The bell chimed as they entered the diner. The familiar smell of coffee and bacon wrapped around them like a warm blanket. Several regulars nodded at Ronnie, no longer with fear, but with recognition and respect. Claire was behind the counter, and her face lit up when she saw them. "Well, if it isn't my favorite customers." She poured Ronnie his usual coffee without being asked. "Look what I found, Miss Claire." Joey proudly showed her a smooth rock from their walk. "That's a beautiful one," Claire said, examining it with exaggerated interest. "Perfect for a rock collection." As Joey settled into their usual booth with his crayons, Claire turned to Ronnie. "How's the job hunt going?" "Filled out 6 applications this morning," Ronnie said, taking a sip of coffee. "Some places won't even look at me, but I'm not giving up." Claire nodded approvingly. "You know, my nephew works at the construction company on Oak Street. They're always looking for strong workers who aren't afraid of hard work." "Really?" Ronnie sat up straighter. "I'd appreciate that lead." "You've come so far," Claire said softly, pride evident in her voice. "The way you've turned things around for Joey and yourself, it's remarkable." Ronnie felt his throat tighten with emotion. "I couldn't have done it without your help, Claire. When everyone else saw a lost cause, you saw something worth saving." Claire waved off his thanks, but her eyes were warm. "All I did was show a little kindness. You did the hard work yourself." "Still," Ronnie insisted, "thank you. For the first time in my life, I actually feel hopeful about the future." Joey looked up from his drawing. "Dad, can I have pancakes?" "Sure thing, buddy," Ronnie answered, then turned back to Claire. "Would you mind getting us 2 orders?" Claire smiled and jotted down their order. "Coming right up." The early morning sun streamed through the windows of Johnson's auto repair shop as Ronnie pulled on his clean blue work uniform. The fabric felt strange against his skin, so different from his old leather jacket. His weathered hands, once used for violence, now held wrenches and socket sets. The smell of motor oil and rubber filled the air, honest smells that reminded him how far he'd come. "Morning, Ronnie," his boss Mike called out from under a lifted pickup truck. "Got 3 oil changes waiting. Think you can handle those?" "Yes, sir," Ronnie replied, still getting used to addressing someone respectfully. The words didn't feel forced anymore. They felt right. 2 weeks into his new job, and already Ronnie could feel the difference in himself. His shoulders weren't as tense. His jaw wasn't permanently clenched. The steady paycheck meant Joey could have new shoes, proper school supplies, and regular meals. Simple things that meant everything. During his lunch break, Ronnie sat on an old wooden bench outside the shop, unwrapping the sandwich he'd made that morning. Joey had helped him pack it, insisting on adding an extra cookie for energy, as he'd put it. The thought made Ronnie smile. His son was different now, too. Joey's teacher had called last week to say he was participating more in class, making friends. No more outbursts, no more hiding in the corner during recess. The nightmares that used to wake him screaming had become less frequent. After work, Ronnie picked Joey up from the after-school program, another new stability in their lives. His son came running out, waving a paper in his hand. Dad, look what I made." Joey's eyes sparkled as he thrust the artwork forward. It was a crayon drawing of 2 figures, a tall one and a small one, standing in front of what looked like their apartment building. Both figures were smiling. "That's amazing, buddy," Ronnie said, his throat tight with emotion. He remembered a time when Joey's drawings had been full of dark colors and angry scribbles. "Should we show this to Claire?" Joey nodded enthusiastically, and they headed to the diner. The bell chimed as they entered, and several regular customers called out greetings. Nobody flinched at their presence anymore. Nobody whispered or stared. They settled into their usual booth, and Joey proudly displayed his artwork on the table. Claire appeared with 2 glasses of water, her familiar warm smile lighting up her face. "Well, what do we have here?" she asked, leaning down to examine the drawing. "It's me and Dad at home," Joey explained, pointing out the details. "See? We're happy." Claire's eyes met Ronnie's over Joey's head, and he saw understanding there. She remembered the broken little boy who had once thrown tantrums in this very diner, the father who couldn't meet anyone's gaze. "Your dad's doing real good at his new job, isn't he?" Claire asked Joey, setting down their waters. Joey nodded vigorously. "He fixes cars now, and he doesn't come home smelling scary anymore. He smells like—" Joey wrinkled his nose, thinking, "Like cars." Ronnie laughed, a genuine, unguarded sound that still surprised him when it came out. He ruffled Joey's hair, feeling the simple joy of being able to touch his son without Joey flinching away. From behind the counter, Claire watched them interact, her heart full. She remembered the first day they'd stumbled into her diner, how lost they'd both seemed. Now here they were, healing, growing, moving forward one day at a time. The morning sun streamed through the diner's windows, casting warm patches of light across the worn linoleum floor. The familiar smell of coffee and maple syrup filled the air as Ronnie sat in what had become his regular booth, watching Joey color contentedly beside him. The past few months had brought changes that neither of them could have imagined. Ronnie's hands, once adorned with biker rings, now bore the honest calluses of construction work. His new job building houses wasn't glamorous, but there was something satisfying about creating instead of destroying. His weathered face had softened somehow, the constant tension in his jaw replaced by the occasional smile. Joey hummed quietly as he worked on his drawing, his small fingers gripping the crayons with determination. His wild outbursts had become rare, replaced by a gentle confidence that grew stronger each day. The dark circles under his eyes had faded, and his shoulders no longer carried the weight of constant fear. "Look, Dad," Joey said, holding up his artwork. "It's our house, and there's you, and me, and Claire, too." Ronnie leaned over to examine the crayon figures. The stick people stood in front of a cheerful yellow house, all of them wearing huge smiles. Claire's figure wore a blue dress and held what looked like a coffee pot. The sight made his throat tight with emotion. "That's real nice, buddy," he said, ruffling Joey's hair. "Real nice." The diner had changed too, or maybe it was just their perspective of it. What had once felt like a reminder of their broken life now felt like home. The regulars who had once eyed them with suspicion now greeted them warmly, asking Joey about school and commenting on how tall he was getting. Claire moved between tables with her usual grace, topping off coffee cups and sharing gentle words with customers. She caught Ronnie's eye and gave him a knowing smile. She'd been there through it all, the hardest days when he'd doubted himself, the proud moments when he'd stood his ground against his past, and the quiet victories of building a new life. The gang hadn't bothered them in months. Greg had finally understood that Ronnie's transformation wasn't just talk. It was carved into every choice he made, every peaceful morning spent with his son, every honest day's work. The leather jacket that had once been like a second skin now hung forgotten in a closet. Joey's teacher had called last week to tell Ronnie how well his son was doing in school. The boy who had once acted out in class was now helping other kids with their reading. "He's got such a big heart," she'd said, and Ronnie had had to turn away to hide his tears. Claire approached their table, coffee pot in hand, just like in Joey's drawing. She topped off Ronnie's cup without asking, a small gesture that spoke volumes about the trust and routine they'd built. The steam rose from the cup, curling in the morning light. "You know," she said quietly, "this place hasn't felt quite right until you two started coming in regular." Ronnie looked up at her, this woman who had shown him kindness when he least deserved it, who had seen something worth saving in both him and Joey. He wrapped his hands around the warm coffee cup, remembering that first chaotic morning that seemed like a lifetime ago. Claire didn't need him to respond. She just stood there for a moment, sharing in the peaceful silence of their transformed lives. They had all come so far from that first day, the angry biker, the troubled child, and the waitress who had believed in second chances. The morning sunlight streamed through the diner's windows, casting a warm glow across the worn leather booths. Ronnie sat with Joey, both of them sharing a stack of golden pancakes drowned in maple syrup. The diner hadn't changed much in the months since they'd first walked in. The same coffee pot still hummed, the same bell still chimed when the door opened, and the same familiar faces filled the booths. But everything else had. Joey's laughter rang out as he drew pictures on his paper placemat with the crayons Claire always kept ready for him. His eyes were bright now, free from the shadows that had haunted them before. He wore clean clothes, and his hair was neatly combed, small details that spoke volumes about the changes in their lives. "Dad, look." Joey held up his drawing, a picture of three stick figures standing in front of what looked like the diner. "That's you, me, and Claire." Ronnie smiled, really smiled, the kind that reached his eyes and softened the hard lines of his face. The leather jacket was gone, replaced by a clean work shirt with Mike's Auto Repair stitched above the pocket. His hands, once clenched into permanent fists, now rested easily on the table as he reached out to ruffle his son's hair. "That's great, buddy," he said, his voice gentle. "Why don't you show it to Claire?" Claire appeared at their table, coffee pot in hand, as if summoned by her name. She topped off Ronnie's cup with practiced ease, her movements as familiar as the diner itself. The silver in her hair caught the morning light, and her eyes crinkled at the corners as she looked at Joey's artwork. "Well, would you look at that?" she said, bending down to get a better view. "You've got quite the talent there, Joey." Joey beamed at the praise, adding more details to his drawing with renewed enthusiasm. Ronnie watched his son, and for a moment his eyes misted over. He remembered the chaos of their first visit, the fear and anger that had filled both their lives. Now they had a routine. Every morning before school, they'd come for breakfast. Ronnie would have his coffee while Joey worked on his drawings, and then they'd head out, Joey to school, Ronnie to the auto shop where he'd found honest work. "Thanks, Claire," Ronnie said quietly, and they both knew he meant for more than just the coffee. She nodded, understanding in her eyes. The diner had seen many stories unfold over the years, but few had touched her heart like this one. The transformation she'd witnessed wasn't just in their appearances or circumstances. It was in the way Ronnie held himself now, shoulders straight instead of hunched, meeting people's eyes instead of avoiding them. It was in the way Joey laughed freely, no longer jumping at sudden noises or hiding behind his father. The morning crowd bustled around them, creating a comfortable backdrop of clinking plates and murmured conversations. Regular customers nodded hello to Ronnie now, no longer averting their eyes. He'd become part of the fabric of the place, just another thread in the tapestry of their small community. Joey finished his drawing and carefully wrote his name at the bottom, adding the date just like his teacher had taught him. The simple act, a child signing his work with pride, spoke volumes about the stability he'd found. Claire watched from behind the counter as father and son shared this quiet moment, their peace no longer fragile, but solid and real. The evening sun cast long shadows across the sidewalk as Ronnie and Joey stepped out of the diner. The bell above the door chimed softly behind them, a familiar sound that had become part of their daily routine. Joey's small hand found its way into his father's larger, rougher one, and Ronnie felt his heart swell with emotion. "Dad!" Joey looked up at him with clear eyes, so different from the frightened, angry child who had first stormed into the diner months ago. "Can we come back tomorrow?" Ronnie smiled, squeezing his son's hand gently. "Sure thing, buddy. Claire would miss us if we didn't." They walked past the storefronts, their reflections moving along the windows. Ronnie caught glimpses of himself. The tattoos were still there, the leather jacket hung on his frame, but something was different. The hardness in his eyes had softened, replaced by a quiet certainty that he'd never known before. Joey skipped a little, swinging their joined hands. "I finished my homework early today," he announced proudly. "Ms. Thompson said my writing is getting better." "That's great, Joey." Ronnie's voice was thick with pride. He remembered the days when Joey would refuse to do his schoolwork, too consumed by anger and fear to focus. Now his son was thriving, showing up to class with completed assignments and a smile on his face. They passed the park where they'd had their confrontation with Greg. The memory no longer brought a surge of anxiety. Instead, Ronnie felt stronger for having stood his ground, for choosing his son over his past. "Look, Dad." Joey pointed at a cardinal perched on a nearby fence. The bright red bird watched them curiously before taking flight, its wings catching the golden light. "It's not scared of us anymore." Ronnie understood what his son meant. The world felt less threatening now, more open to possibility. The weight of his past choices still existed, but it no longer defined him. Each step forward was a choice to be better, to do better, to love better. They stopped at the crosswalk, waiting for the light to change. Joey leaned against his father's side, comfortable in the silence between them. The trust in that simple gesture meant everything to Ronnie. He thought about how far they'd come since that first chaotic day in the diner, when Joey had been so lost in his pain that he could only express it through destruction. "Dad," Joey's voice was thoughtful. "I'm glad we found Claire's diner." "Me too, buddy." Ronnie's voice was gentle. "Me too." The light changed, and they crossed the street together. The setting sun painted the sky in shades of pink and gold, turning their familiar neighborhood into something magical. Other families were out walking too, and for the first time, Ronnie didn't feel like an outsider. He was just a father, walking with his son, heading home after a good day. Joey's hand remained firmly in his as they walked, their footsteps falling into an easy rhythm. The future stretched out before them like the street ahead, clear and bright and full of possibility. Ronnie felt a deep sense of peace settle over him, knowing that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. They continued their walk home, hand in hand, father and son moving forward into the evening light. The simple act of walking together, of being present in this moment, felt like a gift. Each step was a reminder that love, patience, and the courage to change could transform even the darkest paths into something beautiful. I hope you like this story. Please share what's your favorite part of the story and where in the world you are watching from. Have a wonderful day.